Hi, everyone. Welcome. We will be starting in just a moment or two to give everyone a chance to sign on. Well, it looks like our sign-ons have slowed down. Do we want to kick it off? Hey. Just one moment and we shall get started here. Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first post-fire webinar on backyard produce safety and soil considerations. My name is Valerie Burrell, and I'm the coordinator for the UC Master Gardener program here in Los Angeles County. And we're so glad to have you all join us on this beautiful Saturday morning. I'm going to quickly go over a bit of housekeeping for today's webinar. Mimi, were we going to show a slide for that?
Yeah, Julia, could you advance the slide for us? Next slide, please.
Great, thank you. This meeting is in webinar format, which means your personal screen will not appear, nor will you be able to speak. Please make sure that your Zoom screen name is clear so that we know who you are. The slides and recording from this webinar will be shared via email with participants and invitees. If you have any questions, please use the question and answer feature throughout the meeting, and use the chat feature for any comments you have or resources you'd like to share. I know so many of us have been impacted by both the Eaton and Palisades fires, and please know that our hearts are with you and we're here to support you in any way we can. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our upcoming trainees for the Master Gardener class of 2026, whose training class that was scheduled to start in February was postponed a year due to the impacts of the fires. I'd like to welcome our seasoned Master Gardeners as well, who continue to show their strength and resilience in many ways. A big welcome also goes out to our UC Cooperative Extension staff and advisors who have joined us today. We so appreciate your guidance, collaboration, and expertise as we all navigate these challenging times. Today's webinar is the first in a series of online trainings that will prepare you for outreach to the public on post-fire impacts and fire-resilient gardening. We're filled with gratitude from the overwhelming generosity of our wonderful colleagues from Northern California, Mimi Enright, Julia Van Soelen Kim, and Dr. Leslie Hart for sharing their work and their own experiences from similar catastrophic fires in Northern California. We're honored to have them with us here today. And now I'd like to welcome our UC Cooperative Extension Director for Los Angeles County, Dr. Keith Nathaniel, who has been the steady voice of wisdom and guidance for us, and especially me, through these challenging times. Dr. Keith?
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I would like to also welcome each and every one of you. Some 80 of you have joined us for this morning's session. We're thrilled that you have taken the interest in understanding how to best support our clientele throughout the county in this post-fire recovery period. And we're so filled with gratitude with the commitment that you share, not just with issues like this, but throughout your Master Gardener experience. And to our trainees, we very much look forward to welcoming you and having you join our Master Gardener family next year. We're excited that you're here with us to help us in this effort. Many of you may know the University of California is the umbrella organization under which the Master Gardener program is housed. And it provides this network of expertise across the state and across the system. And so that's why we're able to welcome our colleagues from Sonoma County and other parts of the state to share with you their experiences in recovering after a fire and their wisdom and their knowledge and their understanding of what's happening with our soils and with our plant material after a fire, and to provide that expertise and that knowledge to you so that when you interact with the public, you're armed with the most current information and resources and knowledge and how to help them best deal with their home horticulture issues. And we so appreciate you. Our colleagues have really put a lot of time and effort into studying and understanding what's happening post-fire. And so this information that you'll get today is some of the best information that you'll get about how to deal with plant material post-fire, how to deal with soils post-fire. We're so appreciative. Our University of California Cooperative Extension family really looks forward to sharing these resources with you through a series of webinars and through a series of workshops. And this is the first. And so we're thankful. And with that, welcome. The next 2 hours are going to go fast, filled with lots of information. Again, as Valerie mentioned, it'll be recorded for you to go back and review and understand. And I'm sure our colleagues will provide their contact information as well. So thank you all very much. We really appreciate you being here. And so I'll turn it back over to Valerie, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Keith. Appreciate that. Now I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Mimi Enright, who is the coordinator for the Master Gardener program for Sonoma County. Mimi?
Great. Thanks so much, Valerie and Keith. And we're happy to be here today to share resources and information with all of you. I'd actually like to start off by saying that we have been with you in spirit. As we tracked the wildfires from Northern California, we were so deeply saddened by the devastation and trauma to the community in Los Angeles County. And we were cheering when we slowly saw containment numbers climbing. I know that always heartens me during wildfires, for us to see that the firefighters are getting control of the fires and the situation is being, the fires are getting under control. Our deepest sympathies to all of you who have been impacted by this trauma, and especially to those of you directly impacted. Sadly, as Valerie made reference to, it was all too reminiscent of the trio of wildfires that struck Sonoma County in October of 2017, when over 6,500 structures were destroyed, which now sadly pales in comparison with the loss that was experienced from the Camp Fire in Butte County in 2018, and now, of course, the losses that you've all experienced in Los Angeles. So we know this is a difficult topic, and some of the photos we share may be triggering. We really tried to be as sensitive as we could with the pictures that we're showing while staying true to depicting what we're trying to illustrate. But please step away at any time if it's too hard. So we're sharing work we developed during and after the 2017 wildfires complex in Sonoma County. During the first literally week of that wildfires complex, we started to receive calls at our Cooperative Extension office with people asking if the produce in their backyards, community and school gardens, and small farms, all of which were impacted by smoke and had a layer of ash, was safe to eat. The number of structures destroyed in the first days of the fire, of course, was unprecedented at that time. As I reached out to food safety experts at UC Davis about possible concerns given the amount of structure loss, we came to realize that there wasn't any research on this topic available. There was information about returning to your home after a house fire and whether household food was safe to eat, but there was no research on the topic of possible contaminants distributed via the smoke and ash generated by a large urban fire to areas that were not directly burned. I started connecting with colleagues in community-based organizations working in food security, and they and others were struggling with those same questions. This led us to develop a community science project, energizing master gardeners and local community members to collect leafy green samples from gardens around Sonoma County while the fires were actually still burning. We froze those samples as we began to seek funding for testing. And this was the inception of the Produce Safety After Urban Fire research that my colleague Julia Van Soelen Kim will be sharing with you today. Several months into our work, after all the produce that had been growing during the fires was long gone, we realized that it would also be of value to collect and test soil samples from some of those gardens. We also strategized as a Master Gardener program to develop outreach in the communities most heavily impacted by the fires. We formed a safe landscaping team. In fact, that may sound familiar to some of you. It was based on the SAFE program that was developed in Los Angeles County, and we certainly built on and leveraged the information that you all had developed in previous years to help us plan our recovery and plan the educational outreach that we could develop to help our community recover. The soils presentation that Master Gardener Leslie Hart will be sharing with you today began with those workshops that we led in 2018. This was then followed by a webinar we hosted in the fall of 2020 when community members who had rebuilt were moving back into their new homes and starting to ask questions about the safety of the soil to grow food. I want to stress that our experience having been through 4 major wildfires in Sonoma County since 2017, that each wildfire is in fact unique. We've tried to frame our presentations today around questions we suspect that you likely are starting to receive from your community, as well as information from our experience that we hope will be of value to you to share with your community. I want to stress we're far from experts. We are sure you're going to have questions today that we aren't going to have answers to. But we certainly hope that what we will share with you today gives you practical and science-based information to share with your community as you begin on your road to recovery. And we look forward to hearing of your work you will be undertaking in your communities that we can possibly learn and build from for future wildfires that we know we will experience in Sonoma County. So to start off our webinar today, we're hoping to get more information to help our presenters frame their understanding of who you all are and what your experiences are in our audience today. So I'm going to do a quick launch of an opening poll and give just a few minutes for you all to participate in this poll that will help our presenters with their framing. So hopefully you all are seeing the poll. Great. I'm starting to see some participation. Thanks, everybody. And perhaps while you all are participating in the poll, I'll just reinforce that our objectives for today, again, we're hoping to equip all of you with the background and resources to provide science-based information for the questions from the public at this stage of your post-fire recovery, and to share our learnings from our post-fire urban produce safety study, and for you to learn about post-fire soil considerations. So I'm just going to give another minute or so for folks to participate in the poll. Sorry, apologies to you who are on browsers and can't see the poll. But hopefully those who are able to participate will give us a good sense for. Okay, it looks like we're evening off on poll participation. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, share those results. So in terms of whether you're concerned about your home gardens from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not concerned, 5 being very concerned, looks like we've got a pretty broad distribution of concern in that regard. Looks like over 60% of you have received questions from the public about fire impact on your gardens. The bulk of you, of course, master gardeners, we're so happy to be here with our fellow master gardeners in Southern California, and a sense of whether you were directly or directly impacted by the fires, or indirectly or not impacted by the fires. So thank you all for helping us with that context. Julia, if we could go to the next slide. So our structure for today, we're just wrapping up our welcome and overview. We'll then turn to my colleague, Julia Van Soelen Kim, who we'll introduce in a minute, who's going to take us through our post-fire produce safety study. We'll then turn to Master Gardener Leslie Hart, who I'll introduce right before her presentation on post-fire soil considerations. Hopefully wrapping up with a good solid 20 minutes to then share some resources and take your questions from you all that you have from our presentation. Again, as Valerie mentioned, we ask that we're going to take all the questions at the end of the webinar. So we ask that throughout the presentations, you add any questions that come up for you into the Q&A box. We'll hold those till the end of the presentations when both Julia and Leslie have wrapped up, and then we'll step through the discussion of those questions with you all. So with that said, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Julia Van Soelen Kim. Julia, if you want to stop share and then reshare with your screen while I'm reading your bio. So Julia Van Soelen Kim is a food systems advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension in the San Francisco North Bay. Julia's applied research seeks to strengthen the viability, equity, and resilience of regional food systems using community-engaged methods. Her focus is directed at enhancing connections between farmers and local consumers by supporting the viability of local agriculture and expanding access to local food. She holds a Master's of Science in Community Development and a Master of Public Health from the University of California at Davis. And with that, I will turn it over to Julia.
Thank you, Mimi. And does it look like screen share is set up there correctly? Great. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on a Saturday morning. And I do hope that we can equip you with some really pragmatic and simple steps to consider your own risk and the risk of communities that you're serving in relationship to eating produce that was grown in gardens that were exposed to wildfire smoke, and in relation to continuing to garden this spring and in future seasons. Again, I'm Julia Van Soelen Kim. I'm a food systems advisor with Cooperative Extension, and I'm a social scientist. I'm a public health professional. I'm not a toxicologist. I'm not a wildfire expert, but just as Mimi said, our community had lots of questions that we were unable to answer after our urban wildfire in 2017. And that led us to initiating a deep dive into this topic. And we're here to share a little bit of what we've learned along the way on our journey of understanding food safety and soil safety after urban wildfires. So our objectives, or my objectives for you all today in this segment of the webinar, is to increase awareness of environmental health concepts that you can have in the back of your mind as you're engaging with the public. And that includes how contaminants can spread in smoke and ash and move through our environment over time. I also want to increase understanding of the potential contamination risk of produce and soil after urban wildfires. And lastly, to provide some practical best practices for produce safety and soil safety to mitigate your risk and to help other community members mitigate their risk. First, I'll talk about those environmental health and risk assessment concepts to give you a lay of the land. Then we'll dive into our own study that we did in Sonoma County. And then I'll conclude with the best practices before handing it off to Leslie, who's going to go deeper into soil. A little bit about the background concepts around environmental health and risk assessment. When the first thing to consider is what contaminants might be found after a fire. And that's a great question. That's exactly what we were asking after our wildfire. And I think it was we received a lot of questions of sort of where to look. Where is the problem? And a lot of people were really concerned about the problem being on the produce that was right in front of them. And I want to help us step back and say that actually there are a lot of exposure pathways that can cause chemicals to move into our body. So we should think about chemicals in air that are carried on smoke and ash particulates through the environment that then can fall on plants and on their surfaces, especially food gardens. Those contaminants can get into soil and ultimately into water. And all along that way, those chemicals can be picked up by the human body, so we can inhale them, we can ingest them through eating produce, or we can have dermal absorption through handling ash or contaminated soil, water, or food. So it's important when we're talking about post-fire food safety and post-fire soil safety to really remember this whole spectrum of environmental pathways in which contaminants are moving through our ecosystem and ultimately affecting our bodies and affecting different parts of our organ systems if absorbed. So there are a number of constituents of concern that can be present after a wildfire, and in particular after an urban wildfire. I'm not going to go into detail here because this isn't my area of expertise, but I'll say that commonly heavy metals are a concern, including lead, arsenic, and other heavy metals. And these can be naturally occurring, as was the case in Sonoma County with arsenic, which meant that our baseline arsenic levels in the soil were actually very high, and it wasn't necessarily a result of the wildfire. So I think that's important to remember that some are a direct result of fire, others are naturally occurring. In urban areas such as LA in particular, lead is a really important consideration in the soil from lead-based paint as well as leaded gasoline and the historical legacy of those remaining in our urban environments. Hydrocarbons are another area of concern, and one of the ones that our study looked at were polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And this can be from organic matter combusting. And so that can be present separate from a wildfire or because of a wildfire. Then dioxins, furans, and other dioxin-like chemicals are a concern. So that's PCBs, PBDEs, pesticides, and the pesticides as they break down, and then petroleum products. So a whole host of things. And of course, these can break down into new chemicals or can combine in heat or in gas form and create new chemicals. It's the complex landscape of what to look at. And we choose to use the word constituents of concern or contaminants to try and be as matter-of-fact as possible. And I'd encourage all of you to avoid talking about toxins in the environment, because that's, I think, unnecessarily alarmist in this context. When we're thinking about who is most at risk if they're exposed to constituents of concern, the most vulnerable group is, of course, children, infants and children. And that's because their brains are still developing and their bodies are still growing. They have a lot more contact than adults do with contaminated surfaces because they're crawling, they're playing in dirt and in sandboxes, and they have a lot of hand-to-mouth action or toy-to-mouth action, which means that they can ingest more contaminants. They also inhale more air to their per body weight. So in terms of poor air quality events, they're also more vulnerable. And then pregnant women and fetuses are, of course, an important vulnerable group, as some chemicals can cross the placenta and affect infant or fetus development. Another vulnerable demographic group are people with chronic illnesses. And of course, this includes asthma, heart disease, anything that's going to make people more vulnerable to contamination and poor air quality events. And then I think an important demographic group that we often forget can be vulnerable to these health impacts are those experiencing economic and social hardship, including food insecurity. So there's a whole range of health problems that can happen if our bodies are exposed to contaminants over time. And many of these effects don't happen until years later. And I want to underscore again that the most vulnerable population here are young children. We can see here that our lifetime cancer risk by our age of exposure, actually 2/3 of this lifetime cancer risk happens between utero and 2 years of age. And so there's a lot of reason to be extra protective to infants and children, and to worry less when we're talking about people who are fully developed and adults. And yet, only a small portion of our lifetime environmental exposure is what ultimately determines our health outcomes. So our physical environment is just 10%, whereas in contrast, our access to healthcare dictates about 20% of our health outcomes across the population. Our health behaviors, whether we have protective or risky behaviors that might contribute to poor health outcomes, represents 30%. Our socioeconomic factors represent 40%. And so these are things that are largely outside of our immediate behavior choices and control, and have to do more with the communities in which we live, work, and play. And this is just another visual to say the same thing, that we at the center, our age, our sex, our genetics are just one small factor in determining our health outcomes. Our individual lifestyle factors, our social and community networks, the environments in which we live and work, and our general socioeconomic and broader environmental factors all play into ultimately dictating our health outcomes. So if we think about how do we even begin to understand in this complex landscape of multiple factors that might dictate whether produce is safe to eat, whether soil is safe to garden in, how do we even begin to make sense of this? How do we measure what is unsafe, or how do we think about what is unsafe? So there's an increased likelihood of health outcomes if what we're talking about is highly toxic, if it's toxic even at very low doses, or whether it's toxic only at very high doses. So for example, lead, people say that there is no safe level of lead for young children, right? It's toxic even at low doses. Whether a chemical is persistent over time, whether it persists in the environment or persists in the body, or whether it's excreted quickly or passes through the environment quickly. What the duration of exposure is, whether it's chronic, which is commonly measured as more than 3 months, or whether it's acute, which is commonly measured as less than 24 hours. And then that personal context that I went into in terms of whether individuals and communities have more vulnerable factors or more protective factors. So with that background in mind around broader environmental health concepts that inform this work, I want to dive now into our community science project that we did in 2017 and in the months and years after in Sonoma County, looking at post-fire produce safety. And just as Mimi said, I want to underscore that every fire is unique. In 2017, our fire had intense heat. It was the first of what then became a number of urban burns. We had 6,500 buildings destroyed, and the fires in Los Angeles resulted in a greater loss of the built environment. We also had widespread ash across the county, and that was really noteworthy. None of us had experienced that kind of widespread ash up until that point. And we had prolonged poor air quality events in which the AQI was high for weeks after the fires. And it also happened in October, which was the height of our harvest season. And so that really weighed heavily on the minds of gardeners and local farmers in our community. And many brought forward this question, which is the produce safe to eat after it's been exposed to urban wildfire smoke and ash? And it was a great question. And as Mimi said, we thought surely the University of California has an answer here. And they didn't. We asked so many different people, and there was very little science on the topic. And we quickly realized that we needed to become the scientists to look at this question. So in just 1 month, while the fires were still ongoing, the Master Gardener program, with Mimi's help, mobilized over 15 volunteers to collect samples at over 25 sites in our community, including backyard gardens, community and school gardens, and urban farms. And the volunteer community scientists collected over 200 samples of leafy greens. We decided to look at leafy greens because they have such a large surface area that we knew, and we knew that they would be exposed to a lot of smoke and a lot of ash. And they were also very plentiful in gardens, so we knew there was a high likelihood that any given garden that we were collecting samples from would have leafy greens. So we looked at kales, lettuces, and collards. And we designed our study in a series of phases. So in the first phase, we collected, well, across the study, we collected a triplicate of our leafy greens. And in the first phase of our study, we looked at 2 sites that were very close to the urban burn to generate our hypotheses. And then as time went by, a new sort of elephant in the room entered, which was, all that produce is long gone. What about the soil? So we went back to sites that we had previously collected leafy greens and then collected soil and further tried to do hypothesis testing around whether produce and soil was safe to eat. And across our study, we were able to ultimately analyze 5 separate sites from varying distance of the urban burn perimeter. And then we wanted to understand that we wanted to understand this context in the context of a cumulative risk of eating produce, because we know that eating leafy greens is really healthy. And so we couldn't just consider leafy greens as something that had contaminants on it. We also had to think about the health benefits, nutritional benefits of eating leafy greens. And so we wanted to put that context of the vulnerable and protective factors around eating produce that was exposed to wildfire results. And this is just a map of Sonoma County and the city of Santa Rosa. And the red color is where the smoke in our county was most dense and then spreads out as we get farther away from the urban burn. And the little crosses are our sample sites. So you can see that we collected samples from across the county with varying degrees of ash deposition from the urban burn. We also had to decide what to look for in our study. And we looked at heavy metals as an indicator. Heavy metals are heavy, so they don't travel that far. And those tests are also more commonly available and easier to interpret. But we wanted to go farther than heavy metals. So we also looked at polychlorinated biphenyls, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, polybromated diphenyl ethers, dioxins, and furans. And again, I'm not a chemist, so if I missaid any of those constituents of concern, please feel free to correct me. And in determining what is unsafe, we considered using these heavy metals as a marker of contamination as an indicator. We also turned to soil screening levels from the Environmental Protection Agency and the, I'm gonna get this acronym right here, and the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment. And those soil and produce screening levels say that their threshold is 1 case of cancer in 1 million people over a 70-year lifetime. We also use Prop 65, which many of you are probably familiar with. You buy some kind of dried food, packaged food, and it might say, warning, Proposition 65. This contains a chemical that may cause cancer, birth defects, or reproductive harm. So we use Prop 65 to also identify safe levels of exposure. And then we referred to our county's own cleanup goals. And it's important to note here that every county may develop their own cleanup goals, and so that's not a universal standard. And what we found is that there was a low concern for produce safety after urban wildfire. Specifically, no samples had detectable levels of lead, arsenic, mercury, or chromium. So that is the good news story of our study. No heavy metals. No samples had detectable polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or polychlorinated biphenyls. And 12 out of 13 samples had no detectable dioxins and furans. And one of those 13 samples had detectable levels, but it was still at concentrations below California's no significant risk level for determining safety under Prop 65. So that's really good news. And then lastly, 12 out of 13 samples didn't have Prop 65 regulated heavy metals. One sample did contain nickel at levels that exceeded Prop 65, no significant risk level, but there's nickel already happening in foods. And so we really didn't have enough information to understand what kind of nickel it was and why it was there and whether it would be present because of the fire. Then we turn to our soil samples. And the other good news story of our study is that soil also has low concern. However, it was a little bit less clear. And so we recommend that more soil testing be done in future wildfires. Heavy metal soil concentrations were below Sonoma County's cleanup goals. As I mentioned, our soils did have arsenic predating the fire. So that's one consideration. No samples had detectable polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. 3 sites closest to the fire had the highest levels of dioxins and furans, but only one of those 3 sites exceeded EPA or OES soil screening levels. But based on further testing at that one site that I mentioned, we hypothesized that those contaminants may have pre-existed the fire as they weren't present elsewhere on the site that we tested. So it could have been that it was brought in with contaminated soil into the garden, separate from being a cause of the wildfire. And as I said, we wanted to really move this understanding, these findings from just sort of the threshold of risk to a more holistic understanding of risk. And so we did a cumulative risk assessment to attempt to understand total risk in the context of multiple vulnerabilities and multiple protective factors. In this case, the vulnerability being the potential for contaminants and the protective factor being the nutritional benefit of eating leafy produce. And with the help of a wonderful public health student who had just finished their master's degree at UC Berkeley, Vanessa Raditz led our work in doing this cumulative risk assessment. And we really were intentional in trying to provide an analysis that was an overestimate of risk, so a very cautious or conservative estimate. Vanessa did that for both soil and produce, and ultimately found that there was a net cancer risk reduction. So if half the population of Sonoma County were to increase their consumption of locally grown produce by 80 grams per day, which they felt was ambitious, then there would still be a net cancer risk reduction. And so here you can see the risk from contamination, the maximum or the maximum possible risk, and then the benefit of eating eating the leafy greens. So returning back to our original research question, is it safe to eat the produce? And what we believe is that in all of the things to be concerned about following our urban wildfire, produce safety was a low concern. We found that it was a low concern of health impacts from ingesting produce exposed to our urban wildfire smoke in San Rosa in 2017, and that in our instance, the potential cancer risk reduction from the nutritional value of eating produce outweighed the potential cancer risk. And we want to remind folks that you need to make your own risk decisions considering the unique nature of your own fire, your proximity to the fire, and your vulnerabilities or your community's vulnerabilities, including chronic health conditions, pregnancy status, young children and infants, and older adults. So with this in mind, I want to share some really practical tips for best practices for harvesting produce. And most of these best practices, luckily, are best practices that we share day in and day out, regardless of an urban wildfire. So it's always a good idea to wash hands before and after harvesting, to pick and choose what to harvest, and to use a common sense yuck test. If it's rotten, if there's bird poop on it, if it's really muddy, don't harvest it. To rinse produce before eating, storing, or cooking with it, and to try and keep the outdoors by removing your garden boots before coming inside. And if you're worried about possible constituents of concern after a wildfire, you'll want to take additional steps to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your community. So that starts by protecting your lungs and your body. So you can wear a respirator mask, wear gloves when gardening, wear outer layers and take them off before coming inside, and remove shoes before coming inside. You can also, or you should absolutely also, discard produce if it's burnt or coated in soot or ash or fire suppression chemicals. Again, that common sense yuck test. If there's tons of ash, you can't see the color of the produce under it, ash is blowing away as you harvest the greens and falling off, then that doesn't pass the yuck test for me, and I wouldn't eat it. And then you'll want to pre-rinse produce that you are planning on eating outside before bringing it inside, just to continually minimize tracking ash in. And I want to close my segment reminding folks about all those protective factors that gardening can provide. So a caring community is absolutely a protective factor in our health outcomes. And what's shown here is a community meal at Barrett Park in Santa Rosa, which is an urban farm, during our 2017 Tubbs wildfire. And you can see people gathering together, they're wearing respirator masks, and they're busy feeding their community. And also a thriving local food system with urban farms and backyard gardens and community and school gardens is also a protective factor. And the photo here is our local food hub, Feed Sonoma, working to distribute emergency food during the wildfire in Sebastopol, outside of Santa Rosa. And for future wildfires, should they affect your community, we always have this simple social media graphic to sum up what we think are the take-home messages from our study, which is to protect your lungs first and foremost. Remember that inhaling smoke has very severe health risks, and that ultimately is the biggest health risk when thinking about gardening in a wildfire context. Second, rinse produce with running water, remove outer leaves or peel produce skins if you see ash. Third, remember that good nutrition builds resilience and that ultimately there's low risk of harm from produce that was exposed to wildfire smoke in our study. And remember to take extra precautions for yourself, your loved ones, or your community if they're vulnerable. That includes children, older adults, and people with respiratory heart disease.
Wonderful. Julia, yeah.
I'll just add one more piece that I want to add, which is that this is an emerging area of research. And I want to underscore that each and every wildfire is unique. And we want to encourage other communities to further this research in a way that makes sense for them. So we can talk more about next steps towards the end of the webinar, but we're excited by possible next steps that might come from the Master Gardener community in Los Angeles. So with that, I want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining on a Saturday. And thank you to those who participated in our produce safety study by opening their farms and their gardens for produce and soil samples. And donating money to help us have enough funds to run those tests. We're also funded by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, by UC Agriculture and Natural Resources, by USDA NIFA, and by residents of Sonoma County who donated in a giving campaign to help us raise enough funds to investigate this topic. I'll hand it back over to Mimi.
Wonderful, Julia. Thank you so much. Great job. All right, now we're going to turn to our next presentation on soil considerations. And extremely grateful to be joined today by Leslie Hart, who has lived and gardened in Sonoma County for over 30 years. Retired after many years of teaching high school chemistry, Leslie became a master gardener in Sonoma County in 2017, the year of our big fires. She became a member of that safe landscaping task force that I mentioned earlier that we modeled after the work that had been done in Southern California that year, with a particular interest in how fire affects soil. Leslie has been an instructor for our Master Gardener training class since 2018, especially with regards to irrigation. She is our go-to irrigation guru and is a Garden Sense consultant, which is a special program we have in partnership with our local water agency, where pairs of Master Gardeners visit homeowners to help them develop practical ways to conserve water in their landscapes. Leslie, deeply grateful for your time and commitment on these topics and for joining us today to help share this knowledge with our colleagues in Los Angeles County. So I will turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you very much, Mimi. And thank you all very much for inviting us to share our experiences from 2017. Hearing about your fires as they happened immediately brought back memories of our fires and the personal and collective trauma associated with them. A number of my friends lost homes, others were evacuated, and all of us experienced the smoke and worry. We remember and want to buoy you as best we can in the midst of your trauma and loss. We are very glad you are with us today. After our fires, as Master Gardeners, we wanted to respond and help our community. As a new Master Gardener, I found this quite daunting. However, my teaching experience in high school chemistry is a lens through which I developed my understanding of what happens in soil during fire. We hope that our post-fire experiences will help you develop strategies that work well for you in LA County. From what we've heard, you are already way ahead of where we were at this stage with regard to soil. We look forward to learning from your experiences. I'm going to begin my presentation by providing an overview of basic soil science, that which we learned in Master Gardener training, then turn our attention to what happens to soil in response to fire. Please note that there will be some fire-related diagrams and photos during my presentation, and be sure to step away if you need to. Here is the sequence of topics. I'm going to describe the components of soil and the importance of organic matter and soil organisms. Then I'll talk about how wildland fires affect soil, including soil heating, effects on microorganisms and organic matter, effects on soil nutrients, and soil regeneration. I will then turn to best gardening practices, including those that address soils that may contain constituents of concern due to the fires. We usually think of soil as being solid and made of minerals. However, mineral particles make up less than half of soil. These minerals originally came from rocks that gradually broke into smaller and smaller pieces. They are the nutrients for plants and for the microorganisms that live in the soil. About a quarter of soil is air, another quarter water. This is a very important half, since plant roots need both air and water to live and grow. The last component is organic matter, which makes up 5% of the soil and ties the other parts together. This component includes living things, organisms, roots, and humus. Let's summarize some of the important roles of organic matter in the soil. It increases the ability of soil to hold water. It holds carbon in the soil and out of the atmosphere, of critical importance in our time of climate change. Organic matter feeds the living organisms in the soil, from the microorganisms to the larger critters we can easily see. Nutrients needed by plants are released gradually from the organic matter and soil microorganisms. Organic matter is a major source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, all of which are non-mineral nutrients required by plants. In this diagram, you can see how the soil particles clump with air spaces around them through which water moves. We call this soil structure. The organic matter, including living organisms in the soil, help to create and maintain healthy soil structure. Organic matter helps to hold the soil particles together in aggregates, resulting in the pore spaces through which air and water move. Soil has layers or horizons, as they are called by soil scientists. As you can see here, most of the organic matter is found in the top layers of the soil, the O and A horizons. These are the layers of soil that are directly affected by fire or indirectly by the removal or scraping of the soil. Here are some terms that we use when talking about how soil forms. In the forest and our gardens and landscapes, plant materials drop onto the ground. When these materials are fresh and easily identifiable, they are called litter. As litter decomposes and is covered by more fresh plant material, what was originally litter becomes duff. And eventually the duff becomes part of the soil in the form of humus. Humus is where many of the microorganisms live, and it provides some of the soil structure. Humus is made up of very complex molecules and other compounds that are difficult to break down any further by the living organisms. Here is an example of the litter, duff, humus, and mineral soil layers. In terms of our gardens, I like to think of compost as being analogous to duff, and organic mulches such as wood chips are like the forest litter. It really helps when I'm on garden sense visits. Although the Tubbs fire burned about the same acreage as your Palisades and Eaton fires combined, a much higher proportion of our fires were in wildland. About 3 times as many structures burned in your recent fires as burned in our Tubbs fire for the same acreage. During a wildland fire, the surface, litter, and duff burn, as well as some of the plants. Some of the heat goes down into the top layers of the soil. The heat does not move down very much, since soil is not a good conductor of heat, especially if it is a fast-moving fire, such as a grass fire. So let's go slowly through this diagram. You can see in orange is representation of the flame, and in yellow, you can see where the heat went down into the soil. And we can see here that even with a relatively high flame, the amount of burn does not move very far into the soil. Only 10 to 15% of the heat produced moves into the top few inches of soil. The yellow box shows the depth of the burn. In Sonoma County in 2017, in places where there was structure destruction in the urban areas, those fires burned intensely. I'm going to talk about urban fires a bit later. Fires in the wildland were relentless, and we watched them move. At the same time, they were generally not intense enough nor stayed in one place long enough to move heat deeply into the soil, nor to create hydrophobic soils, which can result in later erosion from water. Here is what happens to the soil during a wildland fire. If the top layers of soil get hot enough to boil water, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, then living organisms will be killed, so the microorganisms in the soil. Hotter temperatures result in burning of the organic matter. So we're talking 400 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. This turns into ash, which makes the soil alkaline, making some nutrients unavailable, such as phosphorus. Some of the nitrogen may be lost to the air. The ash is like chemical fertilizers. Some of the minerals in it may be immediately available to plants and can result in plant growth, assuming the ash is pushed down into the soil. This is temporary. And we're talking here largely about the cations, such as sodium, magnesium, and calcium. We can ask, how hot was the fire? This is a photo from the Mendocino Complex fire in Lake County in 2018, which is north of us. This fire was mainly in wildland. A friend of mine who's a firefighter said that what happened in this area was that there was so much brush in the forest that the fire burned hot and completely in many places, resulting in the patches of white ash we see here. White ash consists largely or pretty well only of minerals. Many of the metals that are commonly found in soil combine with oxygen to form oxides, and oxides are usually white in color, hence the white patches. In this photograph, we also see patches of black ash, which indicated fires of low to moderate burn severity with charring. There is still carbon present. It's like charcoal. Another effect of burning the soil organic matter is the loss of what we call soil structure. This happens under very high temperatures, 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The movement of water through the soil may be changed as a result of that. And water-soluble plant nutrients, which have been released from the burned organic matter in the form of ash may be leached beyond the level of the plant roots. There are no microorganisms left or organic matter to capture those nutrients and keep them in the upper layers of soil. The good news is that after fire, over time, organic matter once again falls on the soil and decomposes. Microorganisms migrate back into the burned soil. Here's what happened in Sonoma Valley Regional Park. By April of 2018, 6 months after the fires, the park was full of grasses and wildflowers. A year after the fires, a friend of mine and I took a trip through Sonoma County, an 8-hour day, looking at what had happened and taking photos a year after the fires. And we saw regeneration of many fire-adapted plants. Most of the plants in these photos are in oak woodland in Sonoma County. Here are examples of toyon on the left and California bay laurel on the right. In this photo, we see bunch grasses and madrone. Note the blackened soil indicating a cooler fire. This landscape is on a property where the landscape itself burned, but not the house. And I'll be talking more about this situation in a little bit. Let's turn our attention to urban fires. Houses contain a lot of fuel. They can burn hot, and the flames jump from house to house. Toxic substances from the contents of our houses can end up in the soil. These include the building materials themselves, synthetic fabrics, and consumer electronics, pesticides, old batteries, old lead-containing paint and pipes, propane tanks, common household chemicals. This is why the top layers of soil beneath burned homes are removed or scraped. Here is what happened to a coin collection, which belongs to a friend of mine who lost his house in these fires. And they had friends visiting while we were on our my friend and I were on our photographic journey. And one of those friends came and said, "Oh, is this silver in this group of coins?" And as a chemistry teacher, I knew that what they were probably seeing, what we were all probably seeing at the bottom, is that it was most likely zinc from the interior of the pennies, which are actually 97.5% zinc. Zinc melts at a temperature close to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So that gives you an idea of the temperature of the fire in that house. Copper on the surface of the pennies and nickel and copper in the quarters require much higher temperatures, so they haven't melted yet. Those temperatures are like 2,000 and above. The fire turned the surface of some of these pennies into brass. You can see those in the front of the photo, and which is an alloy of zinc and copper. My high school chemistry students made what we called gold pennies in lab by heating them in a Bunsen burner. Here, the fire was hot enough to do the same thing. Let's briefly check in about where the cleanup process is right now in LA County. According to what I read on the state of California and US EPA websites earlier this week, phase 1 was officially completed on February 25th, with the exception of ongoing lithium-ion battery work. Phase 2, the removal of the remaining debris, began a few weeks ago. The same process is what happened for us in Sonoma County, though I think they are moving faster in your county this year. Many of you probably already know that information about the cleanup process is available from the LA Department of Public Health and the state of California. There are many links within these websites to other relevant sites, such as the EPA and Army Corps of Engineers. Note that links to these websites and other resources that I'm going to be including in this presentation are listed on the last slides of the presentation and are also in the resource handout. Let's turn our attention to recommendations and best practices for how to mitigate the soil problems found after wildfires. When preparing for our public workshops in 2018, we found it useful to think in terms of different scenarios when considering how to answer questions from the public. The photos on this page are snapshots of these scenarios for Sonoma County. And you may have some of these same scenarios, and you may have others from your particular situation in LA County. But this is what made sense to us. The first scenario is ash falling on landscapes and gardens from a fire that is at some distance. No destruction on the property where that ash is seen. Other scenarios include destruction of the landscape without damage to the house or other structures. Those are the other two pictures at the top of the slide. Another scenario is a structure fire close by, but not on the same property. And the last one is a destruction of both house and landscape. And the way the concerns on in each of these situations, although there are similarities, there are also some differences. And so we found it helpful to think about them in this way. When we began our recovery in Sonoma County, the first questions from the public were about produce, as Mimi and Julia talked about. And as Julia said, it was October, prime harvesting season. Later, we turned our attention to soil and sought help from a number of sources in identifying and mitigating potential contamination of soil and the presence of constituents of concern, the ones that Julia described. And Julia's description of the community science project about produce and soil reflects this sequence of our process. And my understanding in LA County, because you have a great focus on urban agriculture, that you have been able to move to the soils piece faster than we did. Eventually, we found these resources, and one of the most important is the urban agriculture field, and including this publication by members of UC and LA and Ventura counties, including your own Rachel Searles, Valerie Burrell, and Andre Biscaro. The second important resource is from the LA County Department of Public Health. Other sources we used, and Julie and Mimi have already talked about some of these, included UC and Sonoma County folks in Northern California, in the urban ag field, in public health, in veterinary medicine, and in waste management. And again, all of the links to these resources are on the last slide and in the resources handout. Let's begin with the first scenario, some ash on the landscape. Wildland fire ash is generally less of a concern than ash that drops from a structure fire that's very close to you. Certainly where I am, which was the closest fire was 3 miles to me, we did see things like embers that we could recognize as being paper. And so there still is a possibility for some contamination. So the recommendation always is, in this type of a situation, that the soil be tested if food is to be grown there. And also to use best gardening practices, and many of which are probably familiar to you with your strong Master Gardener emphasis on urban agriculture in LA County. And the last section of my presentation will be about those best practices. And you'll see a lot of what Julia talked about will be reflected in mine as well. In particular, we wonder if this type of situation is one that has been seen in your community and school gardens. And Julia's presentation addressed this situation. Let's turn our attention to the scenario where the landscape was destroyed, but structures close by were not. The fires reduced the amount of organic matter found in the top layers of soil. Recommendations for landscape mitigation depend on what types of plants were already in the ground. And in this case, I'm thinking of landscape plants rather than food. So my garden sense experience lends me to be looking at properties that way. And so in this situation, this is a master gardener's garden, and her house was okay, but her landscape burned. And she just let the soil be over the winter, and in the spring, up came her natives. She had planted a lot of California natives. And so in this situation, where you have natives, we recommend that you just let the soil be. On the left is the example before, right after the fire, and on the right-hand side is the following spring in the same place. California natives have adapted to landscapes that burn and that have less nutrient-rich soil. And the fire on this property clearly was not severe enough to go deeply into the soil and kill the root systems of these plants. Non-native plants require more nutrients, so one of our local soil scientists in the North Bay recommended adding a couple of inches of compost on top of the burned soil. He also suggested the use of a broad fork to aerate the soil before adding the compost, depending on how deep the burn was. Renew the compost as it disappears into the soil. And if you're planning to grow food, then the recommendation is to test your soil. Let's turn our attention to situations where there was a higher probability of contamination from the constituents of concern that Julia talked about in her presentation. These include landscapes near burned structures. The presence of wind-blown ash and/or soot on structures and/or landscape increases the possibility that there has been some contamination. And the last scenario in this that we will talk about is the fire destruction of both house and landscape. The 250-foot measurement that I provide you there was actually one that I learned from a town hall that I watched by the LA County Department of Public Health a couple of weeks ago. And one of the speakers specifically said, if you're, less than 200 feet from a burned structure, then there is likely to be contamination in the soil. So the overall recommendation is that if there is any reason to think soil may be contaminated, the best way to know is to get the soil tested. And I'm going to talk specifically about soil tests later. If the property is near burned structures, then there may be constituents of concern on neighboring properties. In this photo, taken a year after the fires, the soil of the adjoining property has already been scraped. And you can see that there are two lighter areas in that photo. While the soil in the foreground of the photo was not part of the footprint of the fire and was not scraped. And this was a year later, and rebuilding had begun in both on this, to the right of this property, you can just see it, and across the street. And this was in Coffey Park, which was an urban area, and this is the property where the coins were found. The recommendations then are to test the soil on the foreground property. You can see some of the grass there. And then the addition of compost and mulch on top of the soil will help to keep down any soil dust that came from next door. The use of drip irrigation is a good way to prevent upsplash from potentially contaminated soil. In this situation, we recommend raised beds or containers for growing food, depending on the history of the site and the results of soil tests. And this is another instance where we wonder whether this is what happened with regard to community school gardens in your county. The last scenario is homes and landscapes destroyed by fire. Here, the first photo is of the rubble that remained from a friend's home soon after the fires in October of 2017. By March of the next year, the soil on their property had been scraped and they were cleared by the county for next steps. In other words, the end of phase 2. And this was 5 months after the fire. The middle photo, which I took a year later on that long trip in the fall of 2018, this middle photo shows the scraped soil after the rubble had been removed. This photo, as I said, shows it a year later. Note the straw wattles added to protect the soil from runoff and mulch to help prevent erosion. The right-hand photo shows what the soil looks like close up. Note the lack of the top dark organic layer. It had been scraped up. These friends rebuilt and returned to this property a few years ago, and they kindly provided these photos to me. Because of the possible presence of constituents of concern, about 6 inches of soil, that which contains much of the organic matter, was removed following the removal of the rubble and ash. New clean soil was brought in after the house was rebuilt. As in the other scenarios, the recommendation is that the underlying soil be tested for constituents of concern. The cleanup contractor may have already performed soil testing, which will provide this information. In Sonoma County, a soil test was required to be collected by the cleanup contractor and the results provided to homeowners before the property was cleared for the next steps of rebuilding. Metals were used as markers of contamination. From what I've read in newspapers and heard from in that town hall I listened to, I'm not sure what the requirements are for the contractors for your county. And so this would be something to follow up on with the county to find out what the situation is. Regardless, we do recommend that the soil be tested. After it's been tested, let me go back. So we suggest a compacted scraped soil be aerated with a broad fork first, if that's possible. And perhaps the contractor will already be doing that when your house is rebuilt. Add the clean soil and then add compost on top of the imported soil. I believe that the addition of soil and compost to landscapes is already required of all new houses built in our county, along with some other landscaping requirements. The rest of my slides are about best gardening practices, many of which you may recognize from your county's work in urban ag. We made additions and modifications that reflect the post-fire conditions. This first slide addresses the safety of people who are working in the garden. The recommendations are separated into those that are always good gardening practices and those that reflect post-fire concerns. So always remove boots and outer clothes before going inside, and be sure to wash hands. In order to reduce direct contact with soil that may contain constituents of concern, or that you know do, wear masks, gloves, long sleeves and pants, closed-toe shoes or boots. Wash or bag gardening clothes immediately. We describe the overall theme as keeping the outdoors outdoors. This slide includes information about how to work specifically with harvesting produce. Good practice includes the following: wash hands before and after harvest, rinse produce inside in cool running water, remove outer layers of produce before eating, storing, and cooking. If the food gardens have been exposed to smoke and ash, protect lungs when harvesting the produce, for example, from a respirator N95 mask. And you probably are recognizing these recommendations from Julia's slides. Discard produce that is burnt or coated in soot, ash, or fire suppression chemicals. And those are your yucky situations. Pre-rinse produce outside before rinsing it again inside with cool running water. In looking forward to preparing food gardening for this coming summer season, consider the history of the site, including potential contaminants pre-fire as well as post-fire. This is definitely best practices at all times. Based on the site history and the grower's personal situation, consider whether to test soil. To further remove risk from contaminants of concern, whether you know they are present or haven't tested the soil, consider using raised beds or containers for growing food. And part of the personal situation I was referring to is cost and ability to do what it takes to be doing that soil testing. In terms of raised beds or containers, there are many container options cheaper than raised beds, such as pots or those cloth grow bags that have become popular, as just a couple of examples. Consider the potential presence of the constituents of concern on different types of food. For example, woody food plants, such as fruit trees, are least likely to be affected. Root vegetables have direct contact with soil, so are probably not a good choice if you're planting directly into the ground. We recommend this hot off the presses publication. This is the fact sheet about home garden and fruit tree safety, and it's not up on their website yet. And so we have provided a link to it directly on the resources handout. This fact sheet, as well as the one for soil, are both relatively short and focused on the post-fire situation. And we hope would be suitable for members of the public that you are working with. At the same time, they are largely based on the longer UCCE and LA County publications about urban ag. Some comments about soil tests. They do cost money, perhaps several $100s for a test that includes metals. Sampling in a particular manner is required. Mapping the sources of the tests on the property is recommended. And depending on the history of the site, you may decide more than one soil test is needed, in which case mapping definitely should be done. In the case of my friend in Coffey Park with the coins, there was there's a rental property on his property, and the tenant, for some reason, had kept old batteries, which were loaded with lead. So that is a particular area that they focused on to make sure that was cleaned up appropriately. And so that's an example of sampling in particular places. Soil tests require someone who's capable of interpreting the results. Home soil tests are not recommended for identifying constituents of concern. They do not measure them. The home soil tests are generally just for those nutrients that are required by plants. So they're not looking at lead or other of the metals, for instance. Here are a couple of good resources for you. The hot off the presses home garden soil management handout, another succinct document for you. And it addresses soil testing amongst other important topics. And in fact, the diagram on that particular document, which shows the sampling sites, actually comes directly from this source that I've already mentioned from your county's Department of Public Health. If the decision is made to test the soil, here is a list of the recommended soil tests. pH, which is a measurement of acidity. Note that most plants require close to neutral or slightly acidic conditions for good growth. pH determines the solubility of many soil minerals, which are many of the nutrients. Most soil minerals are more soluble in neutral to acidic soils. Ash can temporarily make the soil more alkaline and thus make the nutrients less available to the microorganisms in plants. See the chart on page 63 of your Master Gardener Handbook if you want more details about this. It doesn't specifically talk about the constituents of concern, but rather about the nutrients that are needed by plants. Organic matter, nutrients, and micronutrients, many of which are minerals, are also required for plant growth and the health of the soil microbiome. The presence of certain metals, particularly those we classify as heavy metals, such as lead, can be used as a marker of potential contamination. And this test was used during phase 2 of the cleanup of houses following the Sonoma County fires. Note that burned industrial or commercial sites will require more detailed tests. Here are best practices for mitigating the effects of constituents of concern in soil specifically. Always keep the soil pH in the neutral range and amend it with suitable amendments if necessary. Compost, 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 the master gardener mantra. In addition to its other important roles, components of compost bind to metals and other constituents of concern, thus immobilizing them, as well as feeding the microorganisms that break down the organic compounds. Promote good drainage and use drip irrigation to conserve water and prevent upsplash that comes with spray irrigation. In order to reduce the effects of constituents of concern, either you know they're there because the site has been tested, or you think they may be there. Then we recommend these steps. Carefully remove excess ash from the surface of the soil. If you know or aren't sure whether there are constituents of concern in the soil, mix the top layers of soil into the deeper soil. Although metals, for example, may still be present, the concentration of these constituents in the surface soils will be reduced. This reduces the danger to kids, for example, who may be mucking about in the garden or landscape. Consider using raised beds and other types of containers for food gardening, in which case you would bring in the clean soil. So here we have more information about raised beds. We recommend that the raised beds be 1 to 2 feet deep. I saw different depths listed in the various resources on urban agriculture. And so here what we're really thinking about is that we want the roots of the food plants to be contained within that container, whether it be the raised bed or a separate container. Put some type of barrier on the bottom of the raised bed, such as water permeable landscape fabric, but do not use black plastic, which is not permeable to water. It's one of those few situations where that landscape fabric is really suitable. Import clean soil and add organic matter to the surface of the soil and in the form of compost and mulch. Here in Sonoma County, and particularly on my property, we have a lot of gophers. So you may want to begin with hardware cloth at the very bottom of the bed. In summary then, fire changes soil. Living organisms and organic matter are temporarily affected. Eventually, soil regenerates. We recommend that you consider the fire-related scenario of those who ask you for help. And use best gardening practices that have been developed for urban agriculture, especially when growing food. Here is the first list of key resources about soil and fire. And these are the ones that have come out of UC ANR. And I've mentioned all of these during, the network itself. I've listed the ANR Fire Network as well as the fact sheets and the publication from your county. In this second slide, this provides the LA County and State of California resources. Now, all of these are included on the resource handout that Mimi is going to talk about in just a moment. And I will go ahead and just get her slide ready to go.
Wonderful. Great job, Leslie. Thank you so much. So grateful for your content development and presentation to this group. So I just threw in the chat a link to a resources handout that Julia and Leslie and I pulled together for this workshop. That does include a number of new UCNR Fire Network handouts that were developed after the wildfires in Los Angeles County. We've got a link to our Food Safety After Urban Fire project webpage. I hope many of you know that we're doing a web migration soon. It may be a little glitchy over the next few weeks. So have some patience if it does get some broken links or any problems during the website migration. We'll make sure we get those fixed as soon as possible. But that's a phenomenal resource. I see Julia's been referring to it already in some questions. She's been grateful. She's been active in the Q&A chat to answer some of your questions already. That's a phenomenal resource because we developed a whole toolkit for any communities that wanted to replicate the studies that we did to further research on this critical topic. We also have linked on there the wonderful soil resources that Leslie included in her presentation and the research work that she did for her presentation. And we also included some recent media resources. Julia has been tapped on a number of occasions, including for a webinar for the LA County Department of Public Health. And some press articles, and we thought those might be of value interest to you as well. So we've got all those in the handout. We also plan to share with all of you the PowerPoint slide deck. I caught, I think, a minor error where I did a PDF of all the slides, combined slides, but I don't think it has where we have where you animate. I think it might not have all the content. So we'll get an updated slide deck to Valerie for her to share with you all and all the registrants and any of the LA County Master Gardeners who didn't have a chance to participate today or register with the recording and the PowerPoint slide deck for your reference as well. So with that, we're ready to turn to the Q&A. Julia and Leslie, we've all been doing a great job on time management. So we've got a solid half hour left for us in the webinar to answer questions you have. I will stress that we aren't the experts in all that. We're not going to have all the answers to all of your questions. And you're raising some really phenomenal questions in the Q&A box. I want to reinforce, if you have questions, it's much easier for us to manage it from one source. So if you have questions, please do add those in the Q&A box. It's much more difficult to manage them across the chat and the Q&A box. I did want to note that Natalie Levy, who's one of your advisors in soil, has been on the webinar, has been seeing some of the questions that you've been asking. I've been chatting with her. Unfortunately, she had to sign off at 11:30. But know that she's been noting the questions. We can certainly share any additional questions with her after the event. So she's understanding the questions that you are surfacing that possibly she can help coordinate responses on as well. Julia and Leslie, any other framing I've missed before we move into the Q&A series? And Julia, you're still on mute, just so you know.
And Mimi, there's one more slide that's part of my slide deck about upcoming events.
Wonderful. Why don't we just tackle that? And then if we run a little late with the questions, thank you, Leslie. I appreciate you prompting that. So do you want to advance to that slide? Great. So these are Valerie shared with us, and Valerie, please unmute and feel free to jump in. Some of the events that are coming up in Los Angeles, and I guess Valerie, I'll turn it to you on these.
Thank you, Mimi. These are just the next three Zoom meetings that are in the same series here that will be coming up, that will be available to both the current Master Gardeners and upcoming Master Gardener trainees, as well as Cooperative Extension staff and advisors. Actually, immediately after this presentation and while you're going through the upcoming trainings in this series, we will start having events out in the public as far as festivals and farmers markets go, where We'll be sending out notifications asking volunteers, including the upcoming trainees, to help with tabling these events to get this information out to the public as soon as possible. So please stay tuned for more information on this. You'll be receiving via email. Thanks, Mimi.
Great, thanks, Valerie.
Okay,
Okay.
so I'll go ahead and end my
Perfect.
slideshow and go
Thanks.
ahead and stop the share.
That was
There we
great.
go.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, let's start in on the questions. First question from Stephanie. And again, make sure you check out the answered questions. Julia's been doing some great responses to some of the questions that she could directly answer, or that didn't need to be held for the live session. So please make sure you check the answered section for some of those answers as well. The first question from Stephanie: does LA County have the same map that was shown, Julia, in your presentation for smoke and ash distribution? And I've been trying to tap my memory banks. I think we went to a Ph.D. student at UC Berkeley to help us with that, if I'm not mistaken. Julia, could you address that one?
Yeah, so this is one of those it depends answers. And there's a lot in our study that is, the answer is it depends. So we did go to a UC Berkeley student to get that. And we had a couple different maps looking at a couple different things. So the UC Berkeley student created a map that was more of a meteorological model of where the ash deposition, there we go, deposition would have landed given the wind patterns and the fire perimeter. And so it was a model. And a model doesn't mean that's actually what happened. Then we also had point in time snapshots of the air quality index. And there were different air quality monitors that we could use. There was sort of like the official air quality monitors that were fewer and farther between. And I don't remember exactly how the official air quality monitors fell in our county. And I feel like maybe there was just one or two. And then there were more community science air monitors that are used with home monitors, in which people are contributing a whole set of data, right? So it's more data points, but it's maybe less accurate. And so it was a little bit of it depends, like, where do we look? Which map do we look at? What point in time? Do we use modeling, or do we use real data? Do we use real data that's limited, but a high bar? Or do we use data that's more robust in quantity, but maybe a lower bar in quality? And so to answer the question, does LA have the same thing? You have lots of data. Whether the data is easily accessible, easy to understand, easy to interpret is another question. And I would turn to some of our academic colleagues to help direct to the best data source. Sorry to give a little it depends kind of answer there.
Unfortunately, that's often the answer that applies. Thanks, Julia. Stephanie also asked, but I know this was before Leslie started her presentation. Based on your presentation, Julia, she was asking, based on these studies, is it still being recommended that soil be removed and replaced? And Stephanie, I certainly hope after Leslie's really comprehensive presentation that question's been answered for you, but maybe if you could add a new question in the Q&A box if there's something more in depth you have beyond that. Jennifer asks about fire suppression chemicals present in soil. I've seen a lot of white crystals in my garden, and I'm curious if this is related or something else. And Julia or Leslie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one.
I don't have definitive, I'm the expert on this type of answer. However, my understanding is that fire suppression chemicals, well, certainly that we see coming from planes are red and they're phosphates. This one should probably go to Natalie, would be my guess.
So that sounds like one to circle back with Natalie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
advising down in Southern California.
And I want to just underscore that in the produce safety study, that we were looking at leafy greens exposed to ash outside of the urban burn area and away from fire suppression chemicals. So that was not something that we were looking at and not something that should have been on any of our produce samples. And agree with Leslie that in our region, the most visible fire suppression chemicals are red in color. And so I'm not sure about the white crystals.
Lee had a question, and I'm not sure exactly, maybe it was around air quality concerns and issues, safety through community walks and drives in the wind, question mark. Lee, I will say Julia did a really nice job answering a question around air quality issues and protective measures and the use of it like N95 masks. So hopefully that may have addressed your question. But if you do have a more detailed question with some more specificity for us to answer, please do re-enter
And
that.
Mimi, perhaps for anyone who's on the phone, maybe I can briefly address that one.
Great.
Which is to say, to remember that the #1 risk to health is breathing in smoke during a wildfire event. So if you're thinking about gardening during a wildfire event, I would encourage you not to do rigorous physical activity during wildfire, to monitor the air quality index or the AQI. And if it's high, to stay indoors. That said, if you want to put on a mask and go pick some lemons briefly, of course, brief, short exposures to high air quality are going to be okay. But remember that really a respirator mask, so an N95 respirator, which is the minimum protection we would recommend, or a P100, which would provide additional protection, would be recommended. And above all, just limit length of exposure and physical activity, like the strenuousness of what you're doing outside during a wildfire event. Now, once the air quality index has returned back to a normal range and you're cleaning your garden or other outside surfaces, that's where you want to remember those different exposure pathways. And remember that, again, the most likely scenario of exposure in that context is kicking ash back up into the air. So you want to avoid leaf blowers. You want to avoid like vigorous sweeping where you're like kicking it back up. There are public health recommendations. I realize they're not all consistent, but you want to use the basic understanding of avoiding kicking ash into the air, whether it's, you're sweeping, you're shoveling, you're shaking off a tree and having ash fall. Those are all things that you want to try and avoid kicking the air or kicking the ash or the soil particulates up into the air.
Great, thank you, Julia. Christy's shared some background about what's happening in the Eaton burn scar. Christy, our deepest sympathies for just the horrifying impact in your community, and raising concerns about limited plans for soil testing or environmental monitoring by the government, and also concerns around, well, it seems to have galvanized, in her case, collecting soil samples and organizing a community effort, which is fantastic. Christy's super excited to hear your starting works in that regard. Concerned about needing government to provide easy access to large quantities of clean soil, compost, and mulch for restoration. And I'm, unless Julia or Leslie or Valerie have thoughts on that, I'm thinking maybe that's one to note for possible actions forward. Valerie, with you and Natalie, for understanding the types of community concerns that are surfacing with communities that were directly impacted by the fire. Any other thoughts anyone would offer on that?
I'm not seeing all of what Christy wrote, but I had the same impression in searching for, oh, here it is. In searching for on the LA Department of Public Health site, what they were doing, and also reading the local newspapers, that was not going to be the individual soil testing that we experienced in Sonoma County. It was part of our experience. So yes, any information that you can provide to folks with regard to what should be measured for, the information both that I talked about, that's also in the soil management fact sheet. And in addition, I was just reading through the LA County soil and water testing guidelines, and there was a list of testing labs in there on page 16 of that particular document. It would be much better if they had, been much, much more supportive, as in the local government. But these are things that we can do as master gardeners, that you can do as master gardeners.
I think I would add to Leslie's comment that while I understand that FEMA has directed the Army Corps of Engineers not to test at individual sites, that there is also the County of Los Angeles, the City of Los Angeles, other municipalities that may bring public funds to bear on this. And then there are also public health programs that are more around environmental justice or health equity, in which they may bring public funds to bear on this. And so just because there's not testing being done paid for at the federal level doesn't mean that there might not be opportunities for public funds to inform this area. And I would say in that second area, that's where engagement with residents, advocacy, education about the need for soil testing is going to make a difference. And so I do hope that that foundations, local government, and local nonprofits are considering that absence of information and maybe open to funding this. For our own project, we did sort of a mix of funding sources, and our biggest funding source was the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And we did have a small emergency grant from the USDA, from NIFA. And then we fundraised just from like a Giving Tuesday campaign or something like that from residents of Sonoma County. And we cobbled together enough funds to do what we needed to do. I did pull up our spreadsheet from our study. And if you remember, we collected over 200 samples of rinsed and unrinsed leafy greens and in triplicate and kales and collards and lettuces. And the idea was that we would be able to see, and different distances from the urban burn. And we thought we would have more funds to compare all of these different scenarios. But ultimately, these tests were very expensive. And so we ended up using about $13,000 to be able to test at just 5 of our sites. And so there was absolutely ample opportunity for us to explore the topic more, but we just weren't able to fundraise to cover those deeper questions. And so hopefully there are different public and private and philanthropic support opportunities to further this question in LA.
I have just a couple of other comments. One is, in listening to the town hall, with the LA County a couple of weeks ago, I believe they talked about doing some surveillance testing in the areas. So not necessarily individual people's homes, but rather throughout the areas. So the county there is stepping up. The other thing that came to mind, and because I have no experience personally with this, is wondering if any of the soil testing would be covered by insurance. So my understanding here from my friends who lost their homes is, that money was flowing both directions in a sense, insurance companies and FEMA and so on. So Homeowners may not realize that at least some soil testing may be covered by their insurance.
Thank you both. Okay, Lee asks a really interesting question. Have results of insects and bugs been tested from fires for that impact on plants and soil? I love the question, Lee. I'm not aware of any research on that, but wanted to check in with Leslie and Julia to see if there's anything in that regard. Fascinating, though.
May I make one comment here, though? And this goes along with after the fire, we get the deposition of organic matter again, and we have the microorganisms coming in. I'm sure the insects and bugs are coming back in. But what's actually happening during the fires, I don't know. Some of them may be so deep in the soil that they will not be affected, since the heat doesn't go down very far.
Leslie. Leslie, Sarah's asking a follow-on question from your presentation. Any idea with native plants that are used for medicine, whether immediate rinsing after dissipation of fire and ash allows for safe use? Or does evapotranspiration make the leaves of, let's say, Encelia unsafe? Thinking of kick up from dry soil post-fire on a native landscape adjacent to fire, not burned directly. I will say it sounds more like, since the plants you're talking about would be used as food.
Yeah.
Given that you're going to be using them as medicine, that I would say Julia's presentation was probably most germane to that. Julia and Leslie, anything you would add?
Over to you, Julia.
So I think it's more or less the same information as my presentation on post-fire produce safety, with the caveat that it's really important to remember the dose and duration of exposure of potential constituents of concern. So when you're talking about more a medicinal use of plants, that to me implies that it might be a longer duration of exposure over time. Like you may be making a tincture or drying herbs to use over time. And so you may want to consider that time factor in terms of the exposure. So I think my presentation was more about going out, harvesting those greens, getting some oranges from your tree, bringing them back in and eating them. And so that dose and that duration of exposure is shorter term when we're talking about directly eating the produce for a snack versus medicinal use.
Polly asks, any recommendations for dealing with existing raised beds that have contained mostly potting mixed, compost or coir, etc., rather than in-ground gardens? So I guess an existing raised bed. So Leslie, do you want to?
I think that you would treat it the same way as you would in ground, that the ash is falling right on top of that. And so the recommendation would be to test the soil in there.
I can add that in our study, when we did our soil testing and we found one site with PAHs that were above recommendations, that site was at a school garden. We did mobilize to then remediate the school garden beds, and they were raised beds. And the challenge was then, where do you put that soil?
Yeah.
And so that was a consideration. So before you start moving a lot of soil, you want to have a plan about like if a raised bed is highly impacted, it's easier to remove that soil than if it's in ground. That said, if you're moving soil, you want to think about where you're going to put the soil, because just dumping it somewhere else and now you have a sand pile for a little kid to play with, or another problem where you then have to move it again. And so the more you're relocating the soil, the more you're moving it where other people might be needing to handle it, the more you're shoveling and aerating that soil and getting it into the air, that's a concern. So I wouldn't say rush towards replacing the soil in the bed. That's certainly an option, but you want to think about how you're going to protect yourself, where you're going to dispose of it, and how you're going to make sure that kids and animals and others aren't then having to handle the soil.
Great, Julia, thank you. All right, another attendee asks or says, I'm trepidatious about using landscape fabric. Don't many of them contain plastic? And that was the recommendation. Yeah, Leslie.
Yeah, so we feel the same way about landscape fabric here in Sonoma County. On our garden sense visits, whenever we see it peeking out of people's gardens, we say, remove, remove. And so I'm looking at this going, okay, I don't really like this idea, but it seems to be the best way to do this. I think there have been some suggestions you could use rocks instead. The main thing is you're trying to prevent the roots from going down into the native soil that may have contaminants in it. So that's your lens through which you should look at that. Yeah, the answer to that.
Great job. Jane asks, how much have the heavy rains in LA since the fires mitigated the problem, other than washing airborne contaminants off of shrubs and trees? Do contaminants go much further down in the soil? Leslie, do you have thoughts on that? Or
some of it's going to, I'm sure a lot of it's going to run off. After all, the contaminants they're coming from above and landing on the surface. So I would think there would be runoff, and so then your creeks and so on are where it's going, unfortunately, and then out to the ocean. And I know they've been doing some, I believe, water testing and beach soil testing in LA County probably around that. Let's see, the heavy rains. If it was I would think that if you had a lot of white ash on there, that this is a situation where that white ash might be pushed into the ground. The other thing is, depending on the amount of burn, I mentioned that there can be leaching. So if there's no organic matter to hang on to those nutrients in the soil. So that means they're going to go down through the soil and into the aquifers underneath, and they'll also go into creeks from on top. That's my best guess. But again, Natalie would be the better source for this.
I would also add to that not all of the constituents of concern are persistent over time.
Mhm.
So that things are getting into the waterway and into the environment isn't inherently bad. Leslie showed some pictures of beautiful wildfires after some of our more wildland wildfires. Wildflowers in wildlands. Sorry to mix my words there. And so we want to think about what's persistent in the environment over time, and that's where there would be greater concern.
Thanks, Julia. So, yes.
So what happens, the metals that end up in the ground, those don't disappear. They can't be taken apart by microorganisms. They are elements at that time, chemical elements. But the organic compounds, even the dioxins, which they'll continue to persist for a while. But again, what I heard from the LA soils person was that generally within 10 years, they're going to be gone, that the soil microorganisms will have done their work and ripped them apart.
Well, 2 hours flew by. It's 11:58.
Oh, my goodness.
Just a few minutes left. I wanted to raise one last question out of the questions that are left. I want to just reflect in honor of the impact in your community and it's clearly reflected in all the questions that you have been answered and unanswered questions you have. And I know there's going to be a lot more work that you all are undertaking to try to help get answers that help your community and yourselves recover, and Valerie and your advisors will of course have access to these and these topics that you all are surfacing. We want to launch a poll, a closing poll, to get some feedback from you before we wrap. But I wanted to ask Julia, there's a question from Victoria, and I'm wondering if maybe while I'm launching the poll, if you could talk about, she's asking, so in terms of keeping children, especially toddlers, safe, are there extra precautions that you would recommend when gardening with young children? Wondering how this will affect our school programs moving forward. And was wondering if you might be able to reflect on that, Julia, while I launch.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, happy to. So this actually relates to another question that I was just responding to, which is whether we have information on backyard chickens. And so our study went alongside a companion study looking at backyard chicken eggs. And one of that study's findings was the presence of heavy metals, in particular lead, in backyard chicken eggs that was not associated with the fire, but was absolutely present in our communities. And so I want to underscore that a number of best practices for working in environmental justice communities are also practices that we want to employ here to protect children who might be exposed to contaminants. So lead is a common concern predating the fire, and now because of the fire. Recommendations there are to wash hands after playing outside, wash hands before eating, to remove shoes before coming indoors, to wipe surfaces frequently, to limit pets exposure to like rolling in the garden and then running indoors. If we're talking about chickens, to have chicken feed elevated off of the ground and to keep chickens inside a coop instead of being able to peck and scratch throughout the garden. And all of those measures are going to help young kids to minimize their exposure. So we want to think about minimizing animals in the home's exposure to bringing contaminants in, minimize children's exposure to bringing contaminants in, minimize opportunities for hand-to-mouth action with young children, minimize trekking contaminants in on our clothes and our shoes. These are all good practices if we're living in potentially communities that have been impacted by industrial contaminants prior to the fire or because of the fire. And so I put in the question about pets and chickens, the link to our resource on chicken eggs, and just wanted to make that connection that study wasn't too concerned about impacts from wildfire, but was absolutely concerned about the historical legacy of lead being picked up in backyard chicken eggs.
Great, thank you, Julia. So it looks about like half of you who are still on the webinar have participated in the poll. I'm going to leave that up just for another minute or so. We want to just reiterate that our hearts are with you as you begin your process on recovery from this devastating event. And we look to learn from your experiences as you're adapting and beginning on your road to recovery, and hope that you will build on some of the work that we began after the 2017 wildfires complex in Sonoma County. But please know that that many of us around the state are thinking of you and our hearts are with you. It's hard not to get emotional. We know what a hard, horrible experience you've been through, and many of us are here to try to help support as you move down the road to recovery. Leslie and Julia, any final comments before we wrap?
We're honored to have been here with you, and thank you for reaching out. It gives us a chance to give back as well.
Yeah. And Valerie, anything before we close out?
Big thank you to Leslie, Julia, and Mimi. We so appreciate you taking your entire Saturday morning to come support us. So we're very grateful for that. And thank you to all the Master Gardeners, upcoming trainees, and UCCE staff and advisors as well.
Well, with that, I think we're going to close out and stay safe, everybody.